Stop saying best practice. That's the name of the article that we're going to be reading today, and stick around to the end where we get a special chat with Will, who wrote this article, Will King, and has his thoughts changed about the article now that he's written it? Have my thoughts changed about the article now that I've read it and I'm talking to him? The gist of this is stop saying best practice and instead start saying what you're practicing. So this is Stop Saying Best Practice, an article written by Will King. You can find Will on Twitter/X at wking___. This is taken from Will's website at wking.dev. So Stop Saying Best Practice, written Thursday, November 9th, 2023. I'll give you the TLDR right here. Stop saying best practice and say what you're practicing. If you've never heard someone tell you about a best practice for whatever job role you're doing, I don't believe you. A best practice to people who build software is like a cold plunge to a VC or CrossFit to a fitness bro, or the recipe that tastes just like the real thing to someone who is gluten-free. They can't help talking about how wonderful it is. And before you start getting fired up, I'm not about to talk about why best practices are bad. I use them all the time. I learn them, I study them, I pay attention when new ones are shared around the community. What I'm going to write about is why calling them best practices is terrible. I could wax poetic, but I can summarize this in a statement and a question. The name best practice tells someone absolutely nothing about what they are practicing. If someone showed you some code and told you this is the best practice, what are you going to say next? Why do we do it this way? Naming matters. Cue the meme about the two hardest problems in software. No matter what name we might use, there will probably be an explanation still needed to deeply understand anything. But I'm going to give 4 new names you could start using to get 75% of the way there. Community pattern. Sometimes the reason you write code a certain way is because everyone else is doing it. This doesn't make it the best inherently, but what makes this a best practice is because when everyone sees it, they know exactly how and why it is there. This is very common in frameworks where the people in the community are already buying into a set of opinions on how to write software. New contributors to your code can hop in and understand community patterns right away. There's a great quote that captures this idea from a blog post written by Nicole Tietz. So yes, as a principal engineer, I view it as my role to keep us off the bleeding edge as much as possible. That way, when we really do need to innovate, we have the capacity to do so, and when we don't need to, we can go really freaking fast. End quote. Readability pattern. A close relative of the community pattern, a pattern that is created for the sake of making more readable code, is not always going to be the best at everything. It may feel more repetitive or take more lines, but the goal is not brevity. Sometimes the two align. Shorter code may make it easier to reason about, but the only true goal is writing code that anyone can reason quickly about. As a JavaScript dev, one that comes up to the forefront of mind is a team's choice to use for of loops instead of reduce. People who really love reduce will not agree, and believe me, I'm a huge fan of functional programming patterns, but not everyone can read a reducer one time and grok what is happening. Instead of adding that barrier, your team may choose to lean towards for of loops to make it a no-brainer when trying to parse the output of the operation in question. Performance pattern. Performance patterns. Patterns of this nature often fly in the face of the previous two. The code to squeeze maximum performance out of the system doesn't always give you the courtesy of being the easy way to write it, but when you need a pattern like this, it is because the trade-off is understood by the team and worth it. Never shy away from heavy documentation on these patterns. Guardrail pattern. This is the last one I will throw in here. Some patterns exist to avoid known footguns. Things like this make their way into community patterns oftentimes, but when these are given the name best practice, it can be easy to confuse the real reason these exist. A favorite of mine is no magic numbers. We have all done this before. If you're unfamiliar, let me give you a quick rundown. Magic numbers are most often numbers used only once, and so you justify in the moment that it would be a waste to put this in some variable. We only need to multiply the total by 47.5%, and here I won't forget why. 2 years later, SpongeBob narrator. Hey, does anyone know why this is multiplied by 47.5%? Oh, that? Yeah, Kevin wrote that like 2 years ago before he left. We don't know why, so we just don't touch it. So enter the guardrail pattern of assigning all of our numbers, even one-off ones, to a variable with a descriptive name. Conclusion. In conclusion, stop saying something is a best practice. Classify your patterns for what they are best at doing and tell me that. Here's the addendum, and if you are listening to this, be sure to check out the show notes in the podcast or the description in the YouTube video for the link to this blog post where the addendum is surfaced. So, addendum. After having this shared around on Hacker News and social, I wanted to make some extra points on top of my points above. 1. When trying to optimize distribution of your information, I get that more people are likely to search or dig into a best practice. That is valid, but if that is how you're hooking people in, make sure you dig deeper than that once you have that attention. And 2. People are smart enough to understand best doesn't mean best. That is a false assumption. You may be experienced enough to make that deliberation based on just reading through what is shared, but not everyone is. It is our job to help those more junior or learning to better understand why something is recommended instead of just saying, do this, but I expect you to know when you shouldn't. The great part is we get Will King, the author of this article, in a special exclusive interview or just a quick chat. But yeah, well, why don't you share a little bit about like who you are,
Sure.
what you do, and then maybe just like your thoughts of what came to be before writing the article. I'd love to hear that.
Cool. So my name's Will King. I'm a primarily a design engineer was kind of where I land. I went to school for design, transitioned to front-end development, and then over the years have just really found myself slotting into kind of that design and engineering role where I get to do both throughout my career, which makes for some very interesting like observations, because I think a lot of developers have that. They're straddling front end and back end. So like they're coming from a very technical and even deeper technical mindset versus kind of like a more creative, like free flowing mindset. And then like balancing that with like the technical side of it. So currently I work at Crunchy Data. We do manage Postgres. And then what kind of like led into this article is just, I am very much but like when I develop with kind of like the design background, the way I approach problems is more in the sense of like what works now, not like what has always worked. You know, like I'm not afraid to explore like something new, and I don't mind coming at a problem using like what has been learned before, aka best practices. But what I would run into was that like developers or engineers that I'd be working with would push back and say like, well, that's the best practice. And then I'd be like, why is that the best practice? And then finally they would try to jump a little deeper into it. Whereas this understanding that I was just supposed to know that it was a best practice for XYZ reason. And it just never like clicked with me. And I'm like, well, why didn't you just call, like, if we're doing it this way because it's easier to read, like, why didn't we just say this is like a readability pattern? You know, like why, if this is because it's like more performant to do it this way, why didn't you just say like, oh, well, this is like the way to do it for performance reasons, you know? And so just, there was these assumptions that get baked into this concept of like something is a best practice, and calling something a best practice does not tell you like, well, what are you practicing? Like, why is it the best? And why is it the best now? Why is it the best here in this case? Because something that is best in one company is not always the best at the other company. And as you get more senior, you can, I don't know if you read through the addendum or not. But in the addendum, there's this commenter when I posted this on, like somebody shared this on Hacker News. And when I saw that, I woke up one morning and saw that it was on Hacker News. I was like, oh, yeesh, this is gonna, and
like, we're in for it now.
Yes. Some neckbeard is like the only way I could phrase this, came in and said, why would you need to specify what the best practice is? Like, we're all smart enough to know why it's the best. I'm like, well, like you might be. Like, you may have been a developer for a very long time. You might have been around when the best practice was created. But like junior developers are not. Somebody who's new to development, new to your team, may not know why that is the best practice. And we should always be writing code in our code bases to support whoever is most junior on our team. Now, that doesn't mean you write things in a worse way, but whether it's through comments or whether it's through like explaining in documentation or in education into your teammates, like, we should be assuming whoever is looking at the code, including us in like 2 years, like, we're going to be dumber than when we wrote it originally. Like, we're not as clever as when we wrote it. So yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think it resonated with me a lot in that sense. And yeah, just first off, like, I can tell that you're like straddled like the design visualized, because like I think your website's absolutely beautiful. So like, I love. Thank you, I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course, I love that aspect, just because that's always been something that I've been forward facing about. Is like I always used to think I was going to be a designer, but I wasn't good enough to be a designer, and I wasn't like I didn't really like I'm going to sit and code for 8 hours, kind of like I'm just a strict developer. So that's where I've kind of always straddled the, customer facing side of development.
Yes. It's a valuable like skill set, because I think a lot of people miss that, like, connecting with how the customer's using the software, not how knocked my mic over. I like to call it like your job as like more the design facing engineer is you're understanding how the customer's using the software, not how the computer's using the software. Like, back-end developers, I see it more as like, you're writing things for the computer, but my job is to make sure I'm writing things for the user. But no, there was one thing that I thought when I sent this article to you and was wanting you to take a look at it, was you came from JavaScript and you moved over to PHP Laravel, and I am very firmly still in JavaScript land. And like, this article, I think, resonates differently for people who are JavaScript developers versus people who are Laravel developers. Is an assumption that I'm making, because Laravel developers, you have a lot more best practices that fall under what I would say the community heading is. Like, the community has decided that this is the right approach to doing these things, and there's a lot more unity around that. Whereas like in JavaScript, like, community patterns are not like a thing as much. So like, there is a lot of like back and forth of like, well, this was a pattern here, but now I'm in this code base and it's not a pattern here. Whereas in Laravel, like, you can switch from code base to code base, and like, I feel like the concept of like, I'm a little more jaded on best practices in JavaScript land than I would be if I was in Laravel land. So I was curious to see like what your thoughts reading through this were, having had a foot in both, like how you see the differences, and like if what the value is in the article, in that perspective, like moving to Laravel.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, it's one that I was thinking of kind of in twofold, because coming from the JavaScript world, but a lot of people might know this or might not know this about me, but I never actually had a strict developer job. Like, I've never actually worked full time as a developer. I did a lot of like contract work where I would build things for people, or kind of was a contractor for specific tasks that were kind of contracted out to me. I did a lot of sales or solutions engineering, where I was kind of like doing developer-ish things, but it was usually like specific for a feature for the company or for a client that we were bringing onto the company. And so I kind of, when I was reading through this, what things really resonated with me was a lot of the times I almost have this thought in the back of my mind, or even just this preconceived notion that people who are thinking through this with me, or people who kind of like see my material or see the code that I've written, I'm always kind of thinking, oh, it's not as good as like someone who has been in the development world. For example, a lot of people in at least like the Laravel world are very like test driven. They're very like, as I'm building out this application, I am testing it. I have actually, except for one video that I made, have not written a single test. And I think most of that, people are like already checking out right now. They're like, I'm unsubscribing from Josh. I'm good to go. But I think most of that, yeah, I think most of that, what this resonated with me within this article is that there's different reasons. I think kind of like what your summary was, and I'm kind of summarizing this and not word for word, but what your summary was that the best practices come from what is the best way to actually build something rather than what's the best way to do this so that I can build it. And I think as a solo developer, so a lot of this things that I've built, like personal projects, I've been the sole developer in for them. And so I don't necessarily need to write that many tests. I probably do, but I don't necessarily need to write as many tests because there's not a bunch of people in the code base who are like, okay, what happens if I break this feature? You know, it's not as important for certain things, even in terms of like how I'm structuring my code or like what specific folders things go in. Yes.
Yep.
I think within like the Laravel ecosystem, there's like, because it's so opinionated, I think is where some of those best practices, quote unquote, kind of fall into, where you have, you know, specific naming conventions where like, okay, everyone has models and controllers and views and maybe they're within Livewire or Inertia, maybe there's something different, but there's still the sense where if you were to jump in even to Next.js, you could have Pages or App Router. And then all of a sudden those conventions are completely different. Someone might have an API folder and someone might have a backend or a DB folder or something like that. So like, I think those conventions is where the best practices flow out of. And within Laravel, the conventions are kind of pretty much set and agreed upon.
I was going to say baked in.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, the piece that really resonated with me was that where I know that I don't do things like a developer who has been working on teams with 20 other developers has within Laravel, just because most of the time I probably don't know, or I don't like, okay. A lot of times I don't split out my files into separate components unless like it just gets too unbearable, and I'm like, okay, here, do it.
Yes.
But if I have but if I was working with a designer, then all of a sudden, okay, I'm creating the component first, and we're making sure that component matches, you know, the design files, and then I'm doing it. But as a solo developer, it's kind of like, okay, I'm building.
Let's see. I think if I could sum it up, it's the project should drive the practice. The practice should not drive the project.
I like that.
And I think there are definitely some cases, and I tried to point this out in a couple places where like there are some cases where there really is the one way that you should do something, or like there is a way that is better, but there are reasons why it's better. And like you should be able to communicate why they're better. You should not just be doing them because that's what I was told why they were better. And when you find something that is that where it's better because it just is, you will find yourself doing them in every project. Like it is truly the best practice, because whether you're working with 1 or 500 developers, like you're still doing it the same way. Whereas I find that they can still be considered best practices, but they're contextualized. I almost wrote another article after like talking with a number of people after writing this article, where like it kind of like got layered. There is globally best practices. For instance, like naming. Like you should have very clear names for your variables. No matter what language you're writing in, a clear name for something makes a difference. And like helps with readability. Doesn't matter whether you're writing PHP or Go or whatever it is. And like maybe the specific convention is different, but like the idea is like naming matters. But then there's like taking a step in, there's like language specific best practices. Taking another step in, there's like team level like best practices or company level best practices. And then like I'm sure there are like some that are even like a little smaller where it's like my personal best practices, but like whatever, that's just like preference that you're not really doing things with others. But like there's these layers where
Or maybe like
something that's right for your team.
best practices.
There we go.
kind of thing.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
a good one. That's a really good one. Where it's like there's team, like this team level where it's like this may not be right for a lot of other teams, but the way that we have our product and project demands it, like this is what works. And like somebody may come in and be able to pick apart, well, I don't think it's right for XYZ reason. Well, like, well, it's right for us because this is why we do it that way. And like same for like languages, like this language just works better doing it this way versus other languages. And there are reasons why. And I think that's just like people getting a tizzy about it because I think developers, and like why I push against this as much is like from a design background, like there are still some rules in design, but like when you find really good design is when you take the rules and notice when breaking them makes a better result. Because like rules are there to keep things consistent and people to feel like they understand something. And when you break a rule is when people are like, wow, that was great. And whereas like developers, like it's almost like the opposite convention where like you're like you are working with a computer. So like the more like predictable things can be, and like they have gone too deep down that rabbit hole of like, we want everything that I do to be predictable. I want every decision to be predictable. And like, that's just not the reality of like, that may be the reality of computer programs, but that's not the reality of balancing writing a computer program and building a business. And I think a lot of developers have uncoupled business needs and software needs, and like things get messy and developers have a hard time letting the mess in, which could be probably like a whole nother article, but
no, that makes a ton of sense. I think I have like 3 questions based off of that. The first one would be, when it comes to then like your thoughts in terms of it seems like a lot of those best practices, when we talked about those different, you have teams best practices, personal best practices, package best practices, language best practice, framework best practices, which usually are come down to, I would say, conventions and just, hey, this is what seems to work best for most people, regardless of what the actual outcome of the product might be. Where do you think preferences turn into best practices, in the sense that you like as an individual,
when does it cross the barrier of like this is a best practice?
You as an individual, you have a preference for something, but then all of a sudden it makes the rest of your application better when you utilize that practice.
So I think that I don't know if I could answer that to the like language and framework level. At like the framework level, it's like, who's in charge? Like who are the most influential people? What are they like? What are the ways that they are taking that framework? Then it's probably best to follow them, because frameworks change over time. There are upgrade paths. And if you diverge from like what they are recommending is the way to do something, you're going to have trouble going from version 6 to version 8 or something, because you chose to be like, well, I want to do it this way. And now you can't get the nice new shiny stuff without rewriting a massive portion of what you're doing. So like within that, like that is kind of like the differentiator when it comes to like framework and language level, is like who's in charge, pay attention to what they're doing, because like that's what matters more than like what you want a lot of times. Okay. But there are a whole lot of like decisions below that it doesn't matter what you decide, you're not going to mess with the framework. And that personally to me comes from use, and like in team settings, it's a matter of like, well, who is leading the team, and or who was here first. I don't believe in it's more of like a matter of like time and pattern recognition than it is like, let's do it this way. Once it gets to like that team level, there's like, okay, well, like, should we write our Tailwind classes as like all just jumbled up together? Should we organize them? Like I saw this one recently where even like Adam Wathan's team does this. When you've got a ton of classes, you can break them up into using like the class names helper. That way you can write things as like individual lines, and they'll say like, well, this line is all my focus styles, and like this line is this, and this line is this, like where it's very well documented. And like maybe that works for your team, and like that's what you want to do. It adds an extra step, and like if y'all decide like that makes it more readable, do it. Fine. Other teams, it may just be like, we're changing things so often. Like, where's your company at? For instance, like I've worked with a lot of startups, like early stage products, where like we built something 1 week and like 2 weeks later that just got ripped out and we built something completely different, because that's what how the product changed. And if we had demanded best practices and we had demanded doing things a certain way, it may have taken us like 2 weeks longer to do something because we wanted to write it in a very like durable, long-lasting way, when like the reality of the business is that like nothing about the business is durable right now. And like you want to write things in a way that like you're not shipping bugs or shipping like debt for you down the road, but like you've got to like accept the reality that like where your business is at is where your head should be with writing code, because it's more important to be able to move quick than it is to like produce the world's best software, so to speak. And like there's a balance there. Like there's a balance, but yeah, when it comes down to like what you asked, where it's like at that personal level, like how do you make that decision of what becomes best practice? It's like repetition. Like what do you see being used a lot in certain ways? Is there somebody who's like more senior or has been around longer who can recommend like, let's just choose this? Because the reality is like 9 times out of 10 it doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter. So like decide on one y'all like and just be consistent. The consistency is, well, I see it in your background, create consistently. Like that's all that matters. Like write consistently, make it predictable. Predictability is the most important part. Is like, if you do it this way here, like let's be doing it that way other places. And until you do it enough times, you don't know like what way you should be doing it predictably.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And I think that that's something that I have always been passionate about as a solo developer, and like most of the companies that I've worked for, even, you know, as a support engineer, sales engineer, solution engineer, it's always been fairly small companies who I've, and the thing that I've always appreciated the most about working cross-functionally with some of those engineering teams has been the scrappiness, I think is one word that always like comes to mind, of like how fast can you actually build something. Not, you know, it might not be the same code practices that you're even in the rest of the application, but in terms of, hey, customer requested this, let's just like see what happens, like throw something against the wall, see if it sticks, kind of thing. And like as a solo developer, like most of the people I know in like the indie hackers kind of community usually are not like fantastic, and not to put this down of like their actual skills, but usually are not like fantastic clean code developers. Usually
because they're not building software, they're building a business.
Yep, exactly. They're building, hey, I don't know the best way to like actually make this feature happen. I don't even know if like this is work, but like it works. It's on the page, and things are running.
Alert,
and
we're all building businesses. There are very few people who are building software. Like you know when you're a developer who's building like software, and you know when you're a developer who's like building a business. Like there are some projects where it's like, oh no, I'm just building this. Like if you're like writing Linux, or if you're writing like something systems level that like a bunch of other things depend on, as like other software depends on your software, because like what you're doing is like a piece of a larger puzzle, then like completely different. But what I'm referring to in like most of what I am writing about is like you're a developer building like a product, or a designer and developer building a product. And like something you mentioned, which is just like, we're just trying to write something quickly, get it out there for the user to see. Like there's something that I actually wrote about a little later. It's called shipping in layers, which is like my approach to this, which is like exactly kind of what you said. Like whenever you're given a feature or you're given a project, you should be able to boil it down to like the core hypothesis of like, we think this is needed because it will do X for the user. And what you do is, instead of building the giant, nice, shiny thing, prove that building X is actually what they want. So ship a very small thing that solves that problem, that doesn't have the bells and whistles, and ship it quick. Validate that that is actually what the user wants, and then layer on new features. Layer on, and guess what? Now that you've shipped it, do you know what you have that you didn't have before you did that? You have feedback and like real like usage from like somebody versus just like your assumption on how somebody would use it. So like, and that's like when you can do that. Like if you're shipping things that are small enough, it's like way easier to maintain like your debt ratio. Like you may have shipped something really quick that had like not the way you would have written it normally, or like you did like XYZ thing different than the rest of your code base because you're just trying to get it out there as fast as you can. If it works, guess what? Layer 1 is like, hey, let's add like small feature 1 and 2, but like let's also like clean up this now that we know this is going to be how they use it, and make it fit with the patterns that we're using other places in our app. You know, like this tiny layer approach allows you to like not only like grow the feature but also polish it along the way without like committing to too much debt up front.
No, I like that. I think it's interesting because as you were saying, a lot of that, especially like the layer piece, which I'll have to read that article on the podcast later and have you back on. But one of the things that really I think, even when it comes to the videos that I make, and most of the videos that I make are for, I want to teach someone how to do something new within Laravel, within development in general, and I feel like I love to take that same approach that I learned building products with teaching. And maybe it was like I learned it teaching and then I use it to build products, and then I still use it with teaching. But I think a lot of the times it's one of those things where within learning, whether you're a new developer or you're someone who's experienced, but you don't necessarily know of, okay, like I've learned about this new feature or new framework or new package or new way of doing something, whether that's like, WebSockets or AI or anything like that. Most of the time, it's very hard to kind of boil it down to, okay, well, how am I actually going to use this in a particular feature, a particular product? And when I'm making videos, a lot of times I try to boil it down to, okay, here's the reason why you would want to do this, why you would want to even learn it. And then we're just going to build something extremely simple. So it's like, I am building out a video. It probably is already out by the time this podcast is published, but I'm building a video with Laravel Reverb, which is its WebSockets package. Okay. And there's a bunch of cool things you can do with WebSockets, like a bunch of multiplayer, awesome stuff. But the first thing that we do in the video is, hey, here's one toggle button on the page that a bunch of people can see, and everyone can turn it on and off. But it's everyone connecting to everyone else's. There's no rooms or separate layers. And a bunch of times I think it's a lot easier, whether you're building a product or teaching someone how to do something, building a feature or even smaller, it's a lot easier to break it up and say, okay, well, the first thing that needs to happen is everyone can connect and see the same thing and see it go on and off. And then all of a sudden it's easier to expand upon that in the future.
You're understanding the fundamental concept before layering on everything else you can do with it, for sure.
Yeah. I had one more question for you, if you're up for it. The thing, when we're talking about like these best practices, and I loved what you had mentioned before about, you kind of had those segments of, hey, this is something that I might have picked up from like a previous team, previous company, but now I'm in control of these preferential best practices kind of thing.
Right.
Or convention, if you want to call it that. But what do you think when you're talking about like that bridge from design into development, that for the most part, not many engineers can say that, okay, like, they might just be taking a design, or maybe like the indie hackers would usually say that I am kind of a designer, but I'm not like, that's not something that I'm thinking about first.
They're wearing
and
so many hats. Design just happens to be one of them.
Yeah, exactly. What do you think is a best practice that a lot of designers or even design engineers use that has made you a better developer?
Ooh. I'm going to need to think on that one for just a second.
Yeah, no worries. Because I think of it in the sense of, from the from my career trajectory, I kind of was in like support and did support engineering, which was mostly like, okay, someone floated up this bug to me and now I have to find it and then talk to the engineers about, hey, here's the bug, here's everything sorted. All of that combined with my recent career of sales engineering has always been, hey, the customer has this particular problem. How do I take what they're trying to say and actually put it into, okay, they don't necessarily want this feature. They just want their problem solved. And that's made me a better developer and teacher, because most people, when they're learning something or they want a product, they're not looking for, hey, I want this really cool, website that I can chat with people. They're looking for, does this actually solve the problem that I'm going after?
Exactly. Yep. And like your job is to have enough wisdom and experience to make that jump. Like what is, and that's like what makes good product people, is like being able to make that jump of saying like, this is what they want. And this kind of ties into like what I think I'm going to settle on is like my answer, which is like understanding the medium. Like your customers don't understand the medium. You do.
Okay.
So they know their problem, but they don't understand all the ways that it could be solved. So like one thing that I think that has made me a better engineer, coming from like a design background, is that designers experiment a lot. And like this kind of goes outside of design as well, which is like just art in general.
Kind of like breaking the rules piece that you were talking about previously.
Yeah, like artists try, and I'm writing actually an article about this that I'm going to publish soon, which is like, are you going to be making more, or are you going to be making like new? And artists experiment a lot. You hear the phrase like they just are throwing paint on the canvas. Like they're also like trying different mediums, like stone or oils or whatever. Like they're doing different things, trying different methods. And like maybe they try all these different things not because they want to be like a sculptor, but like they want to try that, and then they bring lessons that they've learned and distill them back into like ways to improve like their medium, like what they love to do. And like in design, you do the same thing. You explore a bunch of different things. You explore different colors, shapes, like layouts, all this kind of stuff. And you distill it. You give yourself time to expand and then contract. I think Aaron Francis has a very similar thing with how he writes courses, with like printing out like a forest's worth of documentation. But it's that same idea, which like I think is developers in a lot of cases, they're used to being given a set of requirements, and your job is just to do that. And they don't, what I enjoy about being more of like a design engineer and like what it brings to my engineering practice, even when I'm not doing the designing part of it, is like give yourself space to explore, try different approaches, try different APIs, different techniques, and try them, distill them, bring them back. You could say it also applies like try different languages, try different patterns, try different best practices from different languages in your language, and just see how it feels, distill it, understand it, and then bring it back to your own practice. And like that just makes you better, because you're not just making more of the same, you're making new. Yeah.
No, that's really good. And I think like you would probably agree then that like every person who usually is a better developer, better designer, better creator, better product builder, most of the time they're like constantly experimenting and crafting, whether that's like, okay, I'm learning a whole new language. I'm never going to use Rust or Go or be it. But like, then okay, not only do I know and might be able to utilize whatever like conventions, best practices, lay in that particular source of material, but you also know, okay, like now I'm not just stuck with, I'm going to, make sure I do everything the exact same every single time, but I also know like, okay, when should my conventions or best practices stray, or when should I start to break those rules, or when should I start to do something else? Like I know that one of the incredible tools within the Laravel ecosystem, Livewire, built by Caleb Porzio, that I really enjoy. It came out of him seeing what was being built in the Phoenix framework with
LiveView. Yes,
Phoenix
very cool.
LiveView. Yep, exactly. and HTMX and a bunch of other stuff that kind of
yeah.
paved the way for that kind of thing. And best practices and standards from tens of years ago. So it's one of those things. Like I feel like your team, your product, your company is probably better off if you know like the reasons why you have those best practices, the reason why you have those conventions, just like you mentioned in the article.
Yep, absolutely. It's easy to get stuck in a local maximum where like all you're allowing your brain to consume or to process is like what is immediately in your vicinity. And so you may think you're at the pinnacle or at the best that you can be, but it's not until you take a broader view, give yourself space to look around, that you realize there's a higher mountain over there. So absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. Well, hey, Will, thanks so much for being the first guest on the podcast.
Thank you for having me on. For anyone, I'm not saying that Josh is going to say yes, but in the effort of like trying hard and shooting your shot, I just sent Josh a DM that says, "Hey, I think this fits. I like what you're doing, and I think this article might fit." So, as a final lesson is, don't ever be afraid to shoot your shot and just connect with people. This is what I've been trying to do for the past year, and I'm glad that you wanted to bring me on, because it's been a lot of fun getting to chat with you. But nothing beats getting out of the lurking mindset and start engaging and connecting with more people on here. So I appreciate that, and appreciate you having me on.
100%. Yeah, it's almost like you broke the rules of best practices of like reaching out to someone. There you go.
There we go.
Bring it all around.
Tie it all, wrap it in a nice little bow as we end. Good job.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And where can people find more about you? I already shared your Twitter and the website, but anything else that would be great to know.
The website and Twitter is basically where I spend all my time when I'm online. And if I'm not there, then it's because I'm with my family. So
there you go. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for listening. Keep creating.